Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined today by Professor Derrick E. White, Professor of History and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. He's the author of several books: The Challenge of Blackness, The Institute of the Black World and Political Activism in the 1970s, which was published by the University of Florida Press in 2011, and incidentally, one of my favorite books. And the more recently published Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Gaither, Florida A&M, and the History of Black College Football, which was just published by the University of North Carolina Press. Of the new book, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Lewis Moore writes for Black Perspectives, Blood, Sweat, and Tears is a game changer. By telling the story of FAMU and football, Derrick White uses the successful coaching career of Jake Gaither to center the Black community and sports in the civil rights struggle for self-determination. How are you doing today, Professor White?
I'm good.
Talk a little bit how you came to this story of FAMU football, Black college football, and of course the great Jake Gaither.
I was, first of all, my mom and uncles went to Kentucky State University here in Kentucky. And so I had been familiar with the stories. The first games as a child that college football games that I went to were Kentucky State football games in which they weren't very good, but the band was amazing. And when I was in Florida, I was a professor at Florida Atlantic, and I was teaching a class in sports history. And I developed this assignment in which students had to do what I called a athletic biography on various institutions in the state of Florida. So public, so you had University of Florida, Miami, et cetera. And some students, this group of students drew Bethune-Cookman and Florida A&M. And they came back, as students do, with the complaint that, Professor White, we cannot find anything on FAMU, or we can't find anything on Bethune-Cookman. And I was like, look, Florida A&M was one of the biggest programs in the country. Is an HBCU. You should be able to find something, right? And so in helping them, look for these materials, it became rather clear that there was not kind of a definitive place for them to look to understand the kind of tone and tenor of Black college athletics in general, but also more specifically Black college football.
It's interesting because one of the things you talk about early in the book is that when we talk about Black college football, Black athletics, we typically look at it through the lens of the first Black in a PWI program. And so there are ways in which we didn't necessarily pay attention. Some scholars didn't pay attention to what was happening at HBCUs. And you talk about this term, sporting congregations, these groups of athletes and coaches and sports writers and fans that, for lack of a better way to describe it, kind of created a church, to be able to celebrate, Black collegiate football. Talk a little bit about those sporting congregations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this Black sporting world as a whole has not gotten the kind of attention that we've seen. And I think that the apt example of church, right, is something that we see, that the church has multiple functions, right? It's not just for salvation on Sundays, right, that it served at various points as a schoolhouse, a meeting house, a place of worship. And what's interesting is that the sporting world had the similar kind of interactions where you had, we had the head coaches like Jay Gaither of the Black colleges, but you had high school coaches, you had alumni that were teachers in their neighborhoods, you had a whole network of sports writers who were publicizing these games all over the country. And so one of the things that came to me is that one of the things that we didn't do in the little bit of scholarship that was available when I had started was that they just didn't really theorize how all these pieces fit together. And for me, coming through kind of mainstream African-American history, I saw this as like, oh, this is not that different. It's just an athletic version of the things that we're seeing in other parts of Black history. And so, I always have loved that Earl Lewis quote where he says, Black people took segregation and made congregation, right? And I think that for me was the thing that you had segregation, but they turned it into something else.
If someone says great Black collegiate football, immediately the name of the program that they think of is Eddie Robinson and Grambling. You chose a different figure. And talk a little bit about why you chose Gaither as opposed to a Robinson or some of the other great coaches, particularly post 1970. And why is it we don't know about Gaither as well as we know about Robinson?
Man, some of it was pragmatism, right? We start with I was working in Florida. It made perfectly good sense to do Jake Gaither. But then as I began to investigate it and you give these papers, early drafts of ideas, and people are like, well, what about Eddie Robinson? And that was the only name. And I was like,
Right.
I mean, Eddie Robinson was good, but Eddie Robinson won his first national title in 1955 by beating Florida A&M at the Orange Blossom Classic, right? So in many ways, one of the things that Jay Gaither was able to do, and I kind of make this point in the book, is that Jay Gaither, in developing the Florida A&M athletic program and football program, made it the program to beat on the way to a national title. So they didn't win every year, but if you won, you had to play Florida A&M. And so for me, Jay Gaither was, when we just look at the college realm, was the preeminent and premier coach.
I had a group of boys who wanted to win, who wanted to excel. Strange enough, it's easier to keep on winning when you're on top than it is to build up to start winning. We kept right at it. We wanted to win. We didn't change our tactics a great deal. We were very strict disciplinarians, and we wanted the boys to enjoy what they were doing and do it because they loved their school and loved success.
What makes Eddie Robinson and Grambling so fantastic is not only did he coach for almost 20 years longer than Jay Gaither, but he also had more professional players. And so when people began to look at the value of Black college football, that value could only be seen through NFL success. And so Gaither, whose best teams were in the 50s when the NFL was still mostly segregated, vis-a-vis, Eddie Robinson, whose teams were better in the 60s and 70s when NFL was much more integrated.
Yeah, that's a great point. You also mentioned one of the little subtle differences between Gaither and some of the other successful Black coaches is that he was someone who actually had come from an HBCU environment. How unusual was that at the time that Gaither came through? And as a comparison, how many of the coaches that we're seeing now at HBCU in football collegiate programs, are coming from HBCU programs themselves?
That's a great question. One of the things that I noticed is that when you look at the early generation of Black colleges, so when you look at the 1890s and early turn of the century college football programs, the men who had the title of coach primarily learned the game at predominantly white institutions. They were racial pioneers. So one of my examples that I talk about quite regularly is Matthew Bullock, who was the first African-American football player at Dartmouth College, gets tapped by John Hope to be the second football coach at Morehouse, right? Because they're like, we need a football coach. Who knows about football? It's these handful of Black players who were racial pioneers at schools like Morehouse, at Michigan, and other kinds of places, and they could only get jobs, right? So Florida A&M was founded by, its program was started by a man named George Sampson, who played at Case Western in Cleveland. And he was a great star, but he was the only Black player on his team, or one of two. And he has a master's degree in mathematics from Case. And when his first job comes open, he gets a job at Florida A&M, and he looks around and he's like, well, what are y'all doing for extracurricular activities? And they're like, nothing. And so he's like, well, let's start football. And that's how the program starts at Florida A&M.
You also talk about the differences between the kind of collegiate programs that are emerging in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. The stark differences between Black college programs that are at private institutions and the ones that are more public institutions like FAMU. Talk about what those differences meant for someone like Gaither, and particularly his abilities to be able to recruit, good Black players to keep them in the state of Florida, in that era.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the pre-World War II Black college landscape, it is dominated by private institutions. Most everyone thinks of Howard and Morehouse, but Fisk, right, Tougaloo, these institutions were the preeminent kind of institutions for Black college life. And many of what we think of as public Black colleges, were what they call normal schools, right? They raised teachers and things of that nature. But after World War II, when Black soldiers come back, they have a little bit of the money of GI Bill in a kind of discriminatory and not equal manner compared to whites. But they want to enroll in Black colleges because white Southern schools weren't letting them in. So they enroll in Black colleges. And Fisk has no space. So when Fisk has no space to add any more than the 550 students that they had, students who wanted to take their GI benefits and go to college went literally across the street to Tennessee State. And so these Black colleges that were publicly funded had more room to grow. They had more resources, more material resources, because the states were paying them and to expand and grow to maintain segregation. And so this opens the door for a HBCU like Florida A&M, but also Grambling, Tennessee State, Jackson State, and others to make tremendous leaps in their success against the private institutions that were Howard or Fisk or, Morehouse even in those eras.
You open the book telling the story of a game between FAMU and Miami.
Ready to go to work is Knight on the quarterback delay, keeps it himself, and he is nailed at the 13-yard line.
Talk a little bit about the dynamics of what it meant to be a program like FAMU, particularly in that period of time after Gaither retires in '69, and you're seeing these emerging national powers, right, in terms of Miami, FSU. I mean, we think about the Miami FSU thing, that was taking place there, but then even the University of Florida, weighs in a few times during this period of time. What does that do to the idea of college football, Black college football, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly as we come to this moment of integration?
Integration eviscerates the kind of talent pool available for African-American colleges, right? Black colleges. And it does so in a couple of ways, right? One is, I talk about this a little bit in the book, is that by closing segregated Black schools, what gets lost in our discussion about, the eventual kind of integration of schools in the South is that it cost, thousands of teachers their jobs, right? And so the football coach at the Black high school doesn't get to be the head football coach at the newly integrated school.
Right.
And so
it's not Remember the Titans. Right.
Right. Remember the Titans that is fiction, is what we like to say. And so most places we see these losses and these losses of these high school athletics, but also high school extracurricular activities are devastating to Black communities because they understood the way that they understood their communities was through athletics, through the band, through the arts program. We're not even thinking about all the ways that you get to put on plays that are devoted to Black life in a Black high school that you can't do or you didn't do in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And so by the time Florida A&M gets the opportunity to play one of the big three predominantly white institutions in the state of Florida, in this case, the University of Miami, they have been struggling in the decade after Gaither's retirement from head coaching, but they've kind of hit this renaissance moment where they've hired Rudy Hubbard, who had been an assistant coach at Ohio State. And he had found that he'd figured out a way to tap into the talent pool. Integration was not as harsh after a decade. So they've figured out the ways that they could recruit. And he fielded one of the really great programs. They were in one of the better runs that they had ever had as a football program. They had won like 23 or 25 games at some point before they faced Miami. And so one of the shocking things to me is that when I first learned of this score, I was like, oh, Miami was favored and upset. But a lot of the sports writers, including the white sports writers in the state of Florida, had FAMU as the favorite in the game, right? You
mentioned Jimmy the Greek, right, of all people, right? Yeah.
Right. You got to be a certain age to recognize a Jimmy the Greek reference. But yes, absolutely. And I think that was shocking to me as a historian. I always say that history is stranger than fiction when you're actually in the archives. And so people who were really close to the game, especially in Florida, understood that Miami was not the powerhouse that we think of in the 80s. And so there's this really that game to me stands as the crossroads, right? That coming into the game, that Florida A&M was the dominant program and that Miami was the program that was on the verge of being shut down until Howard Schnellenberger was hired as the coach. And there's all these interesting kind of dynamics, if you're a sports fan, that happened in this game. So Vince Coleman, who is the Major League Rookie of the Year for the St. Louis Cardinals in 1986 or 1987, is the kicker for Florida A&M, right? Jim Kelly, who is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, is the backup quarterback for Miami.
Yeah.
Mark Richt, who was the coach, longtime head football coach at Georgia and most recently at the University of Miami, was a backup quarterback at Miami as well. So you have all these great Mark, you're a New Yorker, right? So,
yes, sir.
So you had Jim Burt was the nose tackle for Miami and that
New York Giants, yeah,
New York Giants, right?
Yeah.
And so there's all this interesting talent on the field, and that FAMU prevails on a goal line stand and a missed field goal, and it's this amazing moment. But as I say in the book, this moment is really fleeting because FAMU cannot sustain its success. And literally 4 or 5 years later, Miami wins its first national title behind Bernie Kosar. This is a tremendous moment for Florida A&M football. And but at the same time, it's a fleeting moment. And it's a moment that I saw as this like, that's what Black college football could have been if given all the right resources and opportunities. But as I discussed in my book, that did not come to be.
Yeah. When folks hear about the Bayou Classic, they think about this tremendous football game that, televised on national television. As a New Yorker, I'm old enough to remember the Whitney M. Young Classic, got to see, Doug Williams play in his senior year at Yankee Stadium against Morgan State. You mentioned the Orange Blossom Classic, right? And that's something that doesn't resonate the same way, at least outside of the state of Florida. But you argue that the development of this Orange Blossom Classic, not only became kind of a de facto national championship, for FAMU, every championship game for FAMU, but it was the thing that really Gaither helped build the reputation of the program and really, Black collegiate football based on, the Orange Blossom Classic. Talk a little bit about this. Yeah.
Yeah, the Orange Blossom Classic was, I think, the most ambitious thing that Florida A&M did as an athletic program. They were not a very good program. They had very little success when they decided that they were going to start a classic in 1933. And lots of schools had engaged in starting these classics. So they're not alone in trying to create one. What's unusual about Florida A&M's is that they understood that they had location in their favor in a way that other people didn't, right? So they're like, we are going to come to Jacksonville initially, and you get to come to the beach and you get to experience the state of Florida. And there were these Black controlled, hotels and tourist industry that had already been built up in the state. And so that by the 1950s, when the Orange Blossom Classic moves to Miami, it is now the premier event, right? Because now there's no professional football in the state of Florida.
Right.
They're averaging over 40,000 fans between 1955 and 1965, right? It is, and many of those fans, 15 or 20,000 are white. That's how many white fans are coming because they are recognizing that this is the very best football that is taking place. And so that once we see, between 63 and 69, Gaither's last year, they called the Orange Blossom Classic the cradle of the pros because NFL scouts, rush down to the game because they are like, look, Florida A&M and whoever they're going to play this year is going to have all the talent in HBCU land. And this is where we need to be to find out who the next players are going to be because, and so the Orange Blossom Classic is just one of the amazing success stories of segregated football. And there's this relationship to the community, especially once they moved to Miami in 1947, and that they're in Overtown and they have these parades and there's all these Black-owned hotels.
Yeah.
And Florida A&M is an extension, right, of this community, right? And And they are Florida's black college in many ways, right? And so they
still are, right?
Yeah, and they still are, right? I mean, Bethune-Cookman would like to argue about this, and I don't have any dog on this fight. That's what I tell. But yes, that's who they are. And that the Orange Blossom, the reason folks don't know about the Orange Blossom Classic is that desegregation and integration really began to undermine the game, that they could no longer get Miami because the Miami Dolphins were playing pretty regularly at the Orange Bowl. So they couldn't get the same weekend. So the game had to be moved around. They're competing for television, right? Because in radio against now Miami and the Miami Dolphins, the University of Miami, with their integrated teams. And slowly but surely, the game begins to lose a lot of its luster, so that by the time they defeat Miami in 1979, the Orange Blossom Classic has kind of fallen by the wayside as the kind of premier event.
Gaither retires in 1969. And for the audience, if you could talk a little bit about what the college football landscape looks in that historical moment, right? This is right before USC, does that smackdown of Alabama that Bear Bryant, as he tells the story, allowed him to then push the trustees and others to allow him to recruit, black football players, right? But the landscape absolutely changes, right? When you think about a Doug Williams, he's actually like the end of a breed.
Yes,
of college football, black college football stars who would go to HBCUs and go right into the NFL. Most of that talent now is going straight to the PWIs, and that's their route. But talk about what the landscape is at that particular moment in time, particularly given what was also happening politically in the country with the civil rights movement and Black Power movement and what have you.
Yeah, like 68, 69, right? Gaither's last 2 years are really this interesting moment. Like the program is for the first time in his 25 years really begins to struggle, and struggle for Florida A&M needs to be qualified. Like they lost 3 games and one of those years, and they sent a letter out to fans and alumni like, we apologize for losing 3 games, right? But they really, they couldn't quite get over the hump. They didn't win the national title. They finished, in the top 5, but 5 or 6 some years. And part of what was happening is that the University of Miami had already desegregated its football team. And so as the high schools had begun to desegregate in 66, and most definitely by 1968, the colleges are slowly desegregating as well. So Florida State, and Miami all had black players. University of Tampa already had a black player. And so in 1969, Gaither, who had really been pushing behind the scenes to play a predominantly white team, and when the program was at its peak, finally got the opportunity in 1969, his last season. He plays the University of Tampa in Tampa Stadium, and they win by 6 points in a really highly contested game that was really an amazing moment for Black college football, very similar to the Miami game. But that moment again is fleeting, because they're like, man, we won this game. We've shown that we can compete at this level. And at the same time, they also are proving to these other predominantly white institutions not across the South that that black players are a valuable commodity and could be recruited to their institutions. And so Gaither's trying to deal with this on the field and in the athletic department, but off the field, you're talking about this rise of this Black Power movement, right? And it's Black athletic. The revolt of the Black athlete is happening across the country at institutions in the North, such as Wyoming or Syracuse, who Black players are protesting because they want, Black assistant coaches, and they want to, they're taking power back from these athletic departments. Additionally, you have Harry Edwards calling for a boycott of the 1968 Olympics. And Gaither, whose best player at the time was Bob Hayes, who was an Olympic gold medalist in 1964, was taken aback that you would not use this opportunity to compete and demonstrate kind of Black excellence on this stage, right? That's a very old model. And so Black Power, as it begins to erupt on college campuses, including Florida A&M's, Gaither is kind of out of step with the student life as well as with the cultural life. But the irony is, and I think this is one of my criticisms of Harry Edwards, is that he was critical of everybody, but he was critical of Black colleges in a way that I thought was disingenuous and unfair to them, in the sense that you're calling for this Black power, Black athletic power, and you wanted more control at San Jose State or Syracuse, when the places that you already had control of were Florida A&M and North Carolina A&T and Howard. And so you're not trying to send these athletes there. You're trying to have them take over these predominantly white spaces. And Gaither is like, look, Black power is cool, but we've always had Black power. Yeah. And he says famously, I quote, this is my favorite quote from him. He's like, we're a Black school being undone by integration.
Right. You know, it's fascinating, right, as you kind of lay this out. 'Cause, you know, you talk about the fact that particularly in the 70s, when some of these HBCU football programs are still rather strong, you know, the PWIs didn't want to play them, right? They didn't want to risk, you know, having to face Doug Williams, you know, for instance, as a college player in 76, 77. I think here at Duke, you know, before David Cutcliffe became coach and the program struggled, you know, for a good 5 or 6 years, it's also at the time when North Carolina Central was dominating in the division that it's playing, and the teams never played. Right. Right. Because, you know, there was a real significant possibility, right, that Central could beat Duke, you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Talk about how some of these Black college coaches navigated this opportunity that they weren't going to get to show how talented they are, you know, against these top PWI, even middling PWI programs, and what that politics looks like now, where basically a lot of HBCUs are willing to take that travel trip for the beatdown that they know they're going to get, because financially, right, they need the money that's going to come from going to play these games.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the things that was really interesting in the archives was seeing the letters that Gaither was writing to the board of higher education in the state of Florida, requesting the opportunity to play a predominantly white team. And we're talking about, at times, we're talking about an NAIA team in the early 60s. At other times, he's asking to play Florida or Florida State. And that gets rejected politically by the governor's office and the governor and the Board of Higher Education. And so what you get is that when these schools were at their strongest, they don't get the opportunity to show or to compete against these predominantly white institutions. And so one of the things I'm trying to dislodge a little bit is this logic of integration, that white spaces were somehow inherently better. And so sports gives us a vehicle to look at actual wins and losses. Right. You know, we're always talking about this metaphorically, when we're talking about institutional level of like higher ed, but what we're talking about here is actual wins and losses on the field. And so these programs really were pushing. And so it's not just Jay Gaither. Eddie Robinson is pushing to try to get these to play certain teams. And so Louisiana Tech, for instance, is always avoiding Grambling. LSU avoided Grambling until recently. And so you get this really tragic story in some ways, in which when Black colleges were at their strongest, they never got the opportunity to play against the flagship state institution. And Southern and LSU have not played ever. Wow. Right. You know, I think they were scheduled to play next year, which I think that's going to be my first trip to LSU Stadium to go watch Southern play LSU. But you're right, in the contemporary context now, so of course LSU wants to play Southern, right? Because LSU is the defending national title champs, right, and they've got all the advantages. It's a safe. And so Black colleges accept this arrangement because that $1 million or $750,000 for that single game against LSU will allow them to balance their athletic budget for the entire year. And so they're doing this thing. Yeah. In some cases, though, you do really get this unique opportunity for Black colleges to step in and really upset the apple cart. And so Howard University, for instance, a few years beat UNLV in a game where they got, I think they made $300,000 and got the W.
With Cam Newton's brother. Yeah.
With Cam Newton's brother. North Carolina A&T's coach beat East Carolina, and he famous is my favorite meme of football season. He says, "Bring me my money," and after they had beat East Carolina. And so I think that these opportunities and these wins and these upsets, like, they never get the kind of accolades that Appalachian State got when they beat University of Michigan 15 years ago. But these victories are very significant, not just because of what happens on the field, but because the politics of these institutions surrounding North Carolina A&T, where, the way integration works is that the state doesn't want A&T to be on par with its predominantly white institutions, right? It doesn't want it to be equal to North Carolina, or it doesn't want it to be equal to East Carolina, right? And so these athletic victories are often signals to the larger possibilities of athletic success at HBCUs.
Yeah. One of the things that I really appreciate about your work, Derrick, and it runs all the way through, whether you're talking about the Institute of the Black World and a vision of Black studies that's independent, to talking about this history of Black collegiate sports, football, and in these Black football programs, it really is founded in this idea of the value of independent Black institutions. As you look at this now, and we're now seeing a trend that seems to be occurring where, at least in terms of high school, right? High school basketball players, Black basketball players are having second thoughts about going to PWIs and choosing to go to HBCUs. Do you think that's something that can be sustainable in this particular political moment? And do you think, because I think this is always the question that comes up with, some of the HBCU programs, kids now are making choices because they want to be visible. If you come to Duke to play basketball, you're going to be on television, national television 15 times during the course of the year. If you go to Howard, that might not be the case. So do you think this moment is sustainable, right? And what do you think that HBCUs really have to gain in doing a better job of recruiting the best talent, to HBCU campuses?
I think that a lot of young people, I won't say most, that's probably unfair. A lot of young people understand college through college athletics. Presidents are fond of saying that, athletics are the front porch of the university. That's like their favorite phrase, right? But if you think about it, like just recently, John Thompson passed. For those of our generation, we know that John Thompson is probably the most important Black coach at an integrated, predominantly white institution in any sport.
Absolutely.
But one of the reasons that he held such accolades is that he made us believe at some point that Georgetown's demographics were similar to the basketball team than what they actually were, right? Like when he passed, the number of people who were on Twitter, or like myself, who thought, man, the only place I've ever seen a basketball team with 14 Black guys and 5 Black assistants, what was like Kentucky State, right? Like, but Georgetown's like, look, so you was like, oh, they must be a Black college. And to turn out that they are nowhere near a Black college, right? And so I think that Black colleges have this opportunity to use athletics to, in this moment that is particularly kind of divisive because of our politics, to really make a claim to reattract Black students to come back, and athletics is an important avenue. I do think that the athletes themselves, especially in basketball, are making kind of a cost-benefit analysis, right? That they are selecting Duke at your institution or the University of Kentucky at my institution, and their eyes are not about what Jelani Favors calls the second curriculum that occurs in the classrooms at HBCUs. No, it's about, they're making a decision like, I'm trying to get to the league. And and so at some point, you as a scholar, but also as a parent, you understand them making these kinds of very rational choices. And so, but I do think that one of the challenges facing Black colleges and Black college athletics is this tension, right? That the future of Black college sports, popular in trying to attract be the most attractive kind of venue is basketball, but Black college life revolves around football.
Right.
Homecoming is at all institutions that's the selling point at Black college, and that's in the fall. And the band operates very differently in football than it does in basketball, right? And it's not to say that basketball environment is not unique and interesting and exciting. It's just not the same environment, right? That doesn't
not the same scale, right? Yeah.
Not to scale, right? I mean, it's just Black folks come out. I mean, even to this day at the FCS level, HBCUs rank in the top 10 in attendance every year because people are coming out for classics, for homecoming. They come out and they go to games. And so this turns up at the turnstile, and basketball doesn't have that same kind of cachet. But the future is much easier to recruit, 3 really great basketball players than it is to recruit 30 people every single year, 20 plus people every single year for football.
What's next for you, Derrick?
Oh man. Since I've been at the University of Kentucky, my colleagues and I have made a set of demands about improving and expanding Black studies, which have been met with some support from the administration. But one of our demands has been the changing of the name of Rupp Arena. Rupp Arena, for those who don't know, is named after Adolph Rupp, who was when he retired, was the winningest coach in college basketball. He coached at the University of Kentucky for 42 years. And our claim is that he was racist. He had one Black player in 42 years. And we are, suggesting that the university, being a forward-looking, progressive kind of ideal, think about what the politics look like when you have a predominantly Black team, playing under this kind of banner. And so I have been tasked by my colleagues, because I do sports and race, and to talk about this at quite a number of levels. And I've stumbled into a project that I think that I'm at the very beginning stages, but I'm pretty confident that it'll be pretty intriguing. And the short version is that the University of Kentucky was the last major basketball program in the state of Kentucky to integrate. And what that means is that University of Louisville or Eastern Kentucky, Western Kentucky, Kentucky Wesleyan, Moorhead, Murray, like all those little colleges that are in the mountains, some are in the western part of the state, they're all over. All of them had found a way to recruit an African-American player before Adolph Rupp, who was the most powerful coach in college sports, could do so. One of those stories has led me to Western Kentucky, which in 1971 went to the Final Four and on the way to the Final Four, they defeated Kentucky in the NCAA tournament by 24 points while starting 5 Black players from the state of Kentucky. And so what's interesting for me is that most people are familiar with the Glory Road story of UTEP. Right. How that happens. And this takes place 5 years later. And so one of the things I think that's key to our argument and my argument about why we think about Rupp's racism is that when confronted with a losing hand and a losing strategy, right, in terms of talent, right, he chooses and is unable to change the composition of his team, while smaller schools were able to take the best players from the state of Kentucky. These guys are not coming from anywhere else. They're not from Philly or Chicago. These are in-state guys. And they turned this into a winning program to go to Western Kentucky's only Final Four. And so I'm examining and researching this story to tell this as an example. To me, it's a quintessential example of what we mean when we talk about even in the 21st century, like diversity. You win with diversity, right? And teams and the places that are slow to do so are out of step and out of lock. And so sports gives us an angle. We talk about this in the theoretical realm in higher education all the time, but sports allows for us to get wins and losses. And so Western's run to the Final Four in 1971 with 7 Black players on the team, 5 starters from all kinds of places in the state of Kentucky, mostly little towns in the mountains in Western Kentucky. Jim McDaniels is the star player who is from Scottsville, and he goes on and plays in the ABA and the NBA for about 10 or 15 years. And so it's an interesting story, and it gives me an opportunity to explore this angle of race and sport, but not through was Rupp racist per se, right, but looking at your failure to be active in recruiting African-American players means that 5 years after really the most famous loss in Kentucky basketball history, you actually suffer a similar loss because you didn't change your strategies.
Yeah, it's like the Boston Red Sox thing. We always want to talk about the curse, but they were the last major league team to sign a black ball player. And when they did, it wasn't a player of impact.
Right.
All right. So what were the opportunities they would have had if they would have been a little bit more aggressive and less racist, for lack of a better way to describe it?
Yeah.
We've been joined today by Professor Derrick E. White. He's a professor of African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky. He's the author of The Challenge of Blackness, The Institute of the Black World and Political Activism in the 1970s, published by the University of Florida Press, 2011. And the more recent Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Jack Gaither, Florida A&M, and the History of Black College Football, just published by the University of North Carolina Press. Thanks for joining us, Professor White.
Thanks for having me.
Black lights and boots burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything.